November 18th, 2023. We started our work session with a site visit out to the Holden Marolt Museum. And now we're back at council chambers for one item on our agenda, which is the Main Street Bus Lane Policy Review.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mayor and Council, for the time. While Carly gets that out, I'll just introduce the team. We have a lot of transit experts today. You have Lim Rumba, Sandy Dobler from the city, Carly McGowan's the project manager, and then we have Kurt Ravenschlag, who's the COO of RAFTA, and Ian Adams, who's the director of operations for RAFTA. Go ahead. We're here today to talk about Main Street Bus Lane and the best use of this lane. Just to give you a little bit of background on the mobility, we are trying to achieve council's #1 goal, and that is to really prioritize transit. It's really important that as we went through the West End and some of those discussions, you know, a lot of times you were asking me, how do we prioritize, how do we help the West End? This is one of those measures that really helps the West End, and we'll get into the details of that, but nothing improves transit like them flying by the cars that are sitting in congestion. And this bus lane is really the best way of doing that to get people out of town easily. With that, I'm going to hand it over so that you get a background of this to Lynn.
Okay, I'm going to date myself here and tell you that in 2003, myself and some previous staff formed an S-Curves task force at council's direction. The goal of that task force was to investigate short-term improvements to traffic through the S-curves. Some of those improvements you still see in place today, the closures at Bleecker and Hallam at 7th, and the Main Street bus lane came out of that S-curves task force. The Main Street bus lane was implemented in 2006 with hours of 3 to 6 p.m. And at that time, you can change slides, Carly. At that time, that was a pretty innovative measure to have a rural resort Main Street bus lane in place. So with that came obviously some opportunities and challenges, as is always the case when you're innovating. The opportunities brought to us by this bus lane are certainly on-time operations for RAFTA, the ridership incentive that comes from exactly what Pete referenced, being in that faster lane, and the advancement of various council goals, whether it's keeping traffic at 1993 levels, the current mobility goal. And then the challenges associated with a lane like this are the enforcement of a timed lane, which is always challenging. Carly will talk about that more in a moment. Obviously, the reduction in parking spaces is always difficult. And then lately, more so what we've seen is construction or large events require us to sign this bus lane for longer hours. For example, during the X Games, we'll sign that bus for 24 hours a day for the entire week of the X Games to keep those buses on time. So that 3 to 6 becomes more challenging when you put in the large number of events, the differing traffic patterns, and construction projects. And I'll let Carly talk to you a little more about that.
Awesome. So Lynn talked us through those the impacts that we consider when we're looking at how to allocate this space on Main Street. Following up on that, I'm going to walk us through why in 2022 we converted the bus lane to the 24/7 bus allocation. Allowing parking in the bus lane during set hours requires a pretty heavy lift and quite frankly a disproportionate allocation of staff resources as far as enforcement goes. Since ticketing a vehicle doesn't immediately remove the vehicle from the bus lane, parking officers would have to handle illegally parked vehicles in the bus lane at 3 p.m. by going one by one into businesses, finding the culprit, kindly asking them to move. In the case that the person with the illegally parked car can't be located, that means staying with the car, calling a towing company, waiting, and all of the implications that come along with that lift. On a typical day, the parking department has 4 officers out on the street. 2 generally are patrolling the core, and then you have 2 over in the residential zones. Each afternoon, in order to make the parking to bus lane switch, we've got to reallocate and pull 2 of those staff members, 2 of those parking officers off of wherever they're patrolling over to Main Street for this more staff-intensive enforcement. It was also not uncommon to see vehicles parked directly in front of the bus stops, which logistically and technically, we can't have vehicles parked there for the sake of keeping those bus stops operable. In addition to concerns with enforcement, there are continual conversations, like Pete alluded to, in the community in the West End about safety and volume of vehicles using the neighborhood streets to exit town. Of course, a critical piece of decreasing the pressure that the West End neighborhood streets feel as far as that afternoon and really flow throughout the day is allowing buses to move smoothly at all times through the Main Street corridor. Allowing the Main Street corridor to function as efficiently and effectively as possible reduces the conflicts that we see in the neighborhood. And when you're able to increase transit efficiency, you're also able to increase vehicle efficiency by reducing merging points between the bus lanes and the general traffic, back and forth, kind of in and out of that bus lane. Using the streetscape on Main to move traffic really increases that effectiveness of the corridor and plays a part in taking the pressure off of the West End. It's also important to consider the roadway geometry. At Pepke Park, with the project that wrapped up last year, the geometry was changed in order to more safely accommodate pedestrians crossing at Pepke Park, but what that means is we rely more on the bus lane orientation to move transit through. As far as roadway geometry goes, of course, there's the safety piece. When you have people exiting and entering vehicles on a 4-lane state highway, that is a safety concern compared to entering and exiting vehicles in a side street location. When the bus lane was converted in 2022, Pete and the parking staff worked with businesses to make accommodations in the parking system to alleviate some of the businesses' concerns. 4 spaces were reallocated from residential allocation to 2-hour spaces. An ADA space was added. There's current construction projects that are limiting the ability to reallocate more spaces at this time, but that's certainly something that we intend to continue to work with businesses on moving forward.
I think this is an interesting start to the conversations we're going to be having in the next 6 to 8 months. You know, this balance, it's really, I can tell you in my position, it's difficult. You want to help the business, you want to help the residents, you want to help the commuters. And you can see as you get into the details of some of these things, that they can sometimes conflict, and sometimes you have to choose kind of the greatest. In this case, you do have 3 options that we presented, but staff felt pretty strongly that this would help the West End, and it has. And that really the power is getting transit out of town faster than the vehicles. In order to really provide the maximum for those buses, you know, at this point, from directions in the past, you know, the council policy is let's prioritize that transit piece in hopes that you relieve some of the congestion in single occupied vehicles. There's other things that you can do here, but staff made this decision over years of looking at it, and we hope that, you know, if we do come to some kind of moderate, you know, of where we think, you just got to remember that parking and transit, you know, it's, as we develop in the next 8 months, we really hope to develop a comprehensive look at all of it and how it all intertwines. And like each one of these things, there's a policy set for us so that, you know, possibly you're not making a decision on every parking space in front of every business, in front of every hotel, and that we have a more comprehensive look of what council policy really wants to look like. And so that's the goal in the next 8 months. We do have, if you would like to talk to RAFTA, Kurt and Ian are here. I should say that I did invite Jason to this work session. We're a little early. I feel guilty not, I know his concerns. He's in the bank side. I should present that side of it. He bought a property that had parking in front of his business, and his situation is real with the construction on one side of the bank and some residential pieces on the part. So he's going to drive for that parking space. It's in direct alignment for the bank, and I just wanted to present that side of it since he isn't here because it's really important to him to have that parking. And thank you for your time. Is there any questions, or would you like to ask specifics to RAFTA or the team?
Sure. I'll start off. First, I'd love to know, like, if is there a log of when there was conflicts? When did we have cars towed? When were RAFTA buses delayed or obstructed leading up to the change in 2022? And then I would also wonder, so what have we done to this point about identifying parking that is available for these Main Street businesses that are on the side streets, first, second, third, fourth, and the like? You know, for me, this isn't, it doesn't have to be all of Main Street, the length of Main Street and stuff. We're talking about a few pocket places. There's a few businesses, there's hotels. So I'm only looking for myself, you know, I'm just looking for a solution here. So those are my two questions. One, what have the incidences been that manifested this change? And two, what have we done already to identify where businesses can have people park in close proximity to their businesses?
Okay, first question, it's one in kind of off-season. Usually you get one on that kind of sneaks out there. Off-season usually isn't as much of a problem as peak. Peak, you get three to four. Well, I will say 3 to 4 after 3 o'clock.
3 to 4 what?
Where there's still people there, like, there's always like 6 or 7, but like Carly described, we would put 2 ambassadors out and they'd split the sections and run into the businesses at 3. You can't do it at 2:59, it has to be at 3 o'clock. And so then they split it out. So but almost daily there would be 3, and you gotta track them down, whoever they are in those 3. And some of the spaces, into your second part, on the residential part, could be managed better. Generally, it's a lot of times the residents use that as kind of a storage. They're very sneaky about how they do it. And they are, you know, they like those spaces because they can kind of move whatever their full-time parking is kind of in spots around there. And so we've kind of fixed that problem. And what we do, the hard part for parking in this area, especially in the ones that you're focused on right now, Tori, is each business kind of has a different set of what they want. So one wants 15. You know, if you have ADA needs, as in the ortho, you know, you're gonna want 2 hour. If you're the hotel, you're not gonna want any of that, right? Like, you're gonna want just normal residential because you can use those lodging permits. And so as you go through this, trying to enact a policy to kind of fit each individual business, you can see where that gets a little clustered. And so when the construction finishes on First Street, that's gonna be an opportunity to kind of help the ortho and the bank. So then you can load it on both sides with either the 15-minute, a 2 hour, and similar to what we did on 5th and 6th in those areas where we were able to do the 2 hours. Construction's limited us a little bit in this area right now. So over there, we did, you know, the 2 hour, and that's worked out pretty well for most of those groups. But we happen to have businesses that kind of are in alignment over on that side. This side's a little more complicated. Does that help?
A little bit. I am not advocating for the hotels to have multi-hour parking for hotel guests. I'm really just talking about serving businesses. So you're saying that on a daily basis, we have 4 or so violators after 3 o'clock kind of thing?
Yeah, it's in that 3 at least. It's safe to say.
Okay. John?
Does a list exist of the affected businesses, that are?
I can follow up with a created list of who we've met with. I think there's 9.
Okay.
Sam?
What was the hour limit before? Was it 2 hour parking?
Yeah, it would be residential rules.
It was 2 hours? Okay. I sort of am going towards the I modify it to noon. I was wondering how strict we could be, like, you know, till noon, strictly enforced underneath, and talk about like very heavy fines, like something that would really disincentivize someone from breaking that rule.
I think if we go down that road, let's do it through the study, because there will present you options of different ways that you can enforce. Generally, fines in this community are a little bit inequitable, and so I want to make sure that we have that whole conversation of where you fit with that, because we have 2 different sides of the spectrum, right? You have the wealthy that don't care. They'll come in and pay 75 tickets at a time. And so if you put heavy fines, they don't care. Whereas in somebody, that could really hurt them if you put a heavy fine and they just didn't know and had an accident or something like that. And so I think that's a bigger conversation if you want to go into the heavier fines. Does it make sense why?
Oh, no, totally. Okay. And then I'm just trying to be creative here as far as I feel like with technology these days, you almost could be like you could park on Main Street and you can text an app like what business you're using so that the parking ambassador knows where the person parking is going into, something like that. And then the other one was, I was wondering, I see Timberline Bank is only open Monday through Friday, but I also was wondering, I haven't asked Jason this, like if they were willing to be open on like Saturday and like if Saturday and Sunday could be like normal parking there rather than weekdays, which I know traffic on Saturdays and Sundays is not usually as bad, that sort of thing.
Well, you got to picture, we can do something like that. That's kind of a bigger, again, that's, you're creating one for one situation instead of an overall policy. We can obviously do that if that's the way council wants to go, but you got to remember Saturday mornings, what's the heaviest outbound? It's the ski traffic, and so you'd be impacting that piece of it, slightly. I mean, you have the workforce. It's all what you want to do. We can do it, but I'm saying, like, I would recommend doing it at a higher policy level.
No, I appreciate that. I guess the last part is just, say we implement a policy as a council of parking until noon. No parking there noon and 6. And noon was a number that you sort of have said, but, I mean, what about like 11 a.m.? Like, what if we give that like buffer that where?
I'd go the other way, go to 2. Anyway, keep going.
No, sure. I mean, but like, I feel like the concern here is not necessarily the ambassadors having to find the people. That is a pain. It's really the amount of time it takes to get a tow truck out there, because the issue is really between 3 and 6. And I feel like the compromise here is the earlier enforcement so that those cars are removed before the issue actually becomes that issue. And that's where I'm like sort of wondering if, I understand the maintain and the bus prioritization, but like, is it really an issue if we compromise and make it that earlier hour? What's really the problem there?
Kurt and Ian could speak differently on how it impacts operations, but it does impact operations. Where you're talking about, like Carly described this a little bit, where you're really wanting the parking really has some conflicts. So not only do you have the conflict, one safety piece about buses is you don't want them to have to get into the lane of traffic in an intersection. That's essentially what we're asking them to do here, but not only get into that intersection, then we have bus stops. So you have a bus stop for, what's the ski resort? Highlands. You have the Highlands bus stop and those that are on that block specifically over there. So the bus actually has to go through an intersection and then pull and kind of find a place. You have one on 4th Street, you have other bus stops. So operationally, it does slow down the buses throughout the day. Now, that's something that was weighed and passed, and it was acceptable. And so, I mean, I think you could hear Tori, like the goal is to get them out before that peak, but the peak keeps extending, right? People are getting out of town earlier, and I can't explain why that is, but people seem to leave the city earlier and earlier for some reason.
To avoid the traffic.
Probably to avoid the traffic.
Oh, and to
Not today.
And to John's point, like how many businesses are we talking about? Because if we're like Timberline Bank, yeah, you'd have to merge during the intersection, but what if the parking was only allowed on the blocks where the businesses are affected, and we're not talking about like the 4th Street bus stop and beyond? I don't know. I just feel like there is that room for modifying and compromise that I'd like to get to. And yeah, we'll see what other council members think, so.
Bill?
Thanks. I think overall, we need to be thinking about this holistically and about improving traffic flow all the way throughout the corridor. And so this is just one piece of that, and perhaps any decision that we make now is sort of a temporary decision that needs to be looked at again once we look at everything holistically. But in terms of questions, have we considered some parking, even if time limited, on the south side of Main as opposed to the north side of Main? Because I don't.
On Main Street?
On Main.
All right, can you go back to the history of that, Lynn, any?
Thinking back to the S-Curves task force, I don't believe they looked at the
Right.
south side as an option for parking.
So maybe that's something that's worth considering because, and I'm not suggesting a study, I do not think this requires a study. I've never sat in backed up traffic on the south side of Main Street going into town. that's not where the traffic exists. So could we have some daytime parking on the south side? Yes, some people would need to cross the street to go to the businesses that they're going to. That's okay, we have crosswalks. But that would not interrupt the bus lane, and perhaps it's time limited again, so that maybe it doesn't start until 10 o'clock after the morning traffic comes through.
I would keep in mind, most of the businesses look at that as direct access, though, so if we do cross the street, especially for some of the physical therapy and stuff like that, it might become problematic. Like
Yeah, I mean, but we
maybe the
can't-
accountants, you know, maybe that works for the accountants in some of those businesses.
I mean,
Nothing's gonna satisfy everybody.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
He's bringing up a suggestion about
1,000
looking
here,
at
so.
the south side for a parking lane.
yeah.
I'm just trying to give you an overall picture of,
I think that if the majority desire here is to revert back to the north side, parking allowed, I would recommend that the city buys or leases its own tow truck, and not rely on an outside one. If it's that consistent of an issue that you have to do it every single day, I mean, this is not a new policy. The signs are there. If you have to tow the cars, you should tow them immediately and not have to wait for a third-party service. So I'm not advocating for that. I think that for now, until we figure out the traffic flow issues and improve upon that, that we should probably leave the bus lane as it is. I don't think it needs to stay that way forever necessarily, but I think that traffic flow needs to be looked at holistically from town all the way to the airport and potentially the intercept lot. But for now, I would recommend keeping the bus lane and thinking about other strategies like parking on the south side of Main, like a variety of different parking options on the side streets. But yeah, if we're gonna keep parking in there, buy our own tow truck. That helps solve a lot of the enforcement issues. And I personally have no issue with you towing cars immediately at 3 o'clock.
Do you know how
Thanks,
much
Bill.
a tow truck is?
I'm sure you can find a used one on eBay. You wanna search?
Yeah, I'm surprised you haven't answered that already. Ward, did you wanna share your point of view here?
Yeah, I think Kurt's here, I'd like to hear his input from the RAFTA side.
Sure.
But one of the top-tier goals for the city council is mobility. And so and one of those goals is to get people those out of signal occupancy cars. So from a high level, I support keeping the bus lane. But I think that one of my questions is, what is the timeline on the commercial activity, the construction activity that's going on that is obstructing the parking for some of these businesses? Because they're supposed to have off-street parking available, but I understand construction projects are making that difficult. So what's the timeline on construction that's obstructing the south side parking on Main Street?
18 months easily.
They just started pouring their foundations.
it's changed every month. I would say that 18 months is probably fair.
So
Could be longer, but 18 months.
So we're looking at, I'm wondering if there's something can be done to free the alleys up for parking for the businesses and forcing, incentivizing or moving the construction vehicles off the alley to make those off-street parking spaces available for the businesses. If we're gonna modify, I don't advocate getting a tow truck. Building more complexity to city government is not my goal. But I think that there should be, if we do modify it and have parking on Main Street, on the south side of Main Street for some hours till noon or 1 or 2, to make sure that those vehicles can be moved to clear up the bus lane for outbound traffic during the rush 3 or 4 hours, formerly known as rush hour. But, so, I guess to sum it up, I want to encourage the buses. I think sitting in a car inching along and seeing a RAFTA bus go by with people enjoying not sitting in traffic is, as the memo says a couple of times, the best advertisement for using mass transit. So I want to figure out a way that we can accommodate both the businesses and RAFTA, but if it means opening up parking for some hours in the daytime, I think that, see what Kurt says about that, but that seems to be reasonable to me. If it's the flow of traffic is adequate during those hours for RAFTA to accommodate the businesses. Because it's going to be, 18 months or longer before, but if there's anything that can be done to get the construction vehicles out of the alleys for the parking, off-street parking for those businesses, I would encourage that as well.
Thanks, Ward. Kurt or Ian, if you guys want to, you've made the time to join us today, and we appreciate that so much. And so I think before you walked in, I had a question about how many incidences have there been? You know, this change was only instituted last year. It'd been no parking from 3 to 6 for probably, when did we institute the bus lane? 12 years prior to that or something? So for a decade or more, it'd been no parking 3 to 6. And do you have any input that you want to share with us?
Sure. Well, good evening, Mayor and members of council. We have Ian Adams here, our Director of Operations, and myself, Kurt Ravenschlag. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for RAFTA. I'll let Ian kind of speak to the specific impacts day-to-day operationally. I'll speak a little bit more bigger picture in terms of what this bus lane offers RAFTA. Anytime you have and I should note too that prior to coming to RAFTA, I was the transit manager and parking manager for the city of Fort Collins, so I do have a little experience in both, wearing both hats. In a managed lane like this, where it used to be previously, where it was 3 to 6 managed, it is really challenging, not only from a parking enforcement standpoint of trying to stay on top of ensuring that that lane is clear and vehicles are not parking there, because they can show up at any point in time and disrupt the operation of the bus lane. And a lot of times those are folks that are probably not from the area, they're not familiar with what the parking requirements are on a particular block, and they inadvertently park there, not realizing that they shouldn't. So that then triggers a lot of work on staff's part to relocate that vehicle. And then welcome to the city ticket for that individual to get their car back. For us, operationally, that can, depending on the time of day and the amount of adjacent congestion, can significantly impact our ability to maintain our schedule, and can result in situations where we now have a bus that's trying to merge back into a lane of traffic, which could be sometimes a dangerous maneuver, trying to make that, especially at heavily congested times, or that bus is just sitting there, unable to get back into the lane of traffic due to congestion, which then deteriorates the level of service that we're able to provide. And the two factors that influence an individual's choice of riding a bus is time and cost. So those are the things that that bus lane affects mostly, is time. It allows us to compete against automobile traffic and allows somebody to look at that bus traveling in that lane to be able to get to where they're going safely and on time. In terms of daily impacts of that, I'll let Ian kind of speak to what he sees on the road.
Yeah, and I have to say what we experience operationally is very much in line with what Pete brought up, about 4 to 5 incidents daily back when it was on the old arrangement, which over a 3-hour period is pretty impactful, especially when we couldn't wait. We had to wait until 3 p.m. We saw a car there at 2:45, and we were hoping it would be gone by 3, but we weren't really able to contact the city until 3 o'clock, and then that would start a process that would take somewhere between half an hour to 45 minutes to have that vehicle moved or at least ticketed. So what we experience operationally is very much in line with what the city represented earlier. In terms of how important and crucial this corridor is for us operationally. Out of the dozen-plus services we operate, all but 3 of those services begin at Ruby Park. The Carbondale Circulator, our Hogback bus, and our Ride Glenwood service are the only ones that don't have their origin right there at Ruby Park. We've made a lot of changes operationally to begin taking a lot of advantage of efficiencies such as interlining, meaning we're using buses for various services throughout the corridor. It's not just a BRT bus, it's a driver doing a BRT portion of their day, then they go to Hogback, then they go to Circulator. Any delays and impacts throughout their day that aren't able to be made up have impacts well beyond where that delay was experienced. So us having this bus lane available to us all the time gives us a lot more reliability and ensures we can provide a lot more reliable service, not just within the city of Aspen, but all the way in Rifle. There could be someone not having to wait an additional 5 minutes for a bus because that bus never got delayed when it was leaving Aspen to begin with. So operationally, what we see out there is very much on with the city, and those crucial hours during rush hour, it's very much needed, but due to the enforcement piece, very often buses, cars don't just poof away and vanish right at 3 o'clock just because there's a sign. So having the availability of it being closed off the entire time gives a lot more ease and enforcement of that.
Ian, how many incidents of parking in the bus lane are you having since the change last year?
It's much, much more diminished. I would say we're down to 1 to 2 a day that are reported by us. Pete and his team might have more contacts that are made from outside of RAFTA, but it's much more diminished. I believe in large part mainly because it's a much easier policy to understand. You don't have to, say, I've never seen like those signs up in New York City where it says every 3rd Tuesday you can park here and every 4th, between these hours. Before it was, not incredibly complicated to understand, but if you were from out of town or, you forgot what day of the week it was because it's also was only in effect Monday through Friday. Saturday and Sunday, it was a completely different set of rules.
Why do you think it's not 0 right now?
I don't know if you'll ever have perfect, compliance with traffic laws, and I think there's always going to be a degree of, hey, wow, I can't believe I was able to get parking in downtown Aspen and there wasn't a car in sight, but, I've seen people park on the pedestrian mall at the intersection of Hyman and Mill. They just pulled up right in front of the popcorn wagon and left their vehicle to go have lunch.
Very convenient.
Probably 50 to 75% of the time now, it's our age-old problem of FedEx, mail carriers, things like that that are kind of moving along the road there. So you do get the occasional one that Ian's describing right there, but it's really some of these companies that their goal is efficiency, and they're going to take the most efficient route no matter what you do.
Yeah, I don't know if I can say this off the record because this is definitely on the record, but our most frequent flyer in terms of who we had to contact for parking enforcement was the United States Postal Service.
Good luck getting that resolved.
So my question is, aside from the amount of cars in a given day that you would report as being parked in that parking between 3 and 6, which you're saying is around 4, how many times has that impacted the bus? How many times has that been a situation where the bus can't just simply go around this car and get it on their way again? I mean, we're really talking about what is the actual impact that we're talking about, not just that somebody's there. Again, for over a decade, we have been no parking 3 to 6. In that decade, I was serving probably 8 years as a city councilman. I don't remember ever having somebody come and say, this is a problem, we have a problem. I never heard that. And then, so, for me, listen, our priority is transit there. I was on city council when we enacted that bus lane, and I voted for that bus lane. But we also have a condition in our community where we are trying to promote and at least make it accessible for businesses on Main Street, because we have such a small commercial core that we are having a problem with locally serving businesses, office space. A lot of them are medical offices out there, and there's a reason they're out there on Main Street, because they can't be in our core. So this is a question for us about really how our community works. And it's not just about transit on our Main Street corridor. It's really about what our Main Street means to our community. So thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you for the information that you have provided for us. I want to get through this item, council members. We have on the screen in front of us options, maintain, modify, review. I am in the camp of modify. I don't think noon is necessary. I think 1, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I don't think it needs to be the entire stretch. I think that there should be buffer or an allotment for the bus stops. So you don't have to have a parking spot directly abutting a bus stop, so that is easier for traffic movements. But I am in a modify. I would like us to figure out how to make this work. And as Ward says, I support that now. In a year and a half, when the building project on First is done, and there's also one in Garmisch, that maybe we revisit this. Maybe when that side street access is returned and maybe it's enough, then maybe we can go back to no parking at all. But right now, I'm in the modified camp. I don't support the noon. I don't necessarily support the map that I have in my packet that has shown where traditional parking has been. I'm okay with moving some of that. It doesn't need to be hard and fast everywhere, but I think that there's an opportunity for modify. That's my input on this issue. Ward, if you want to re-summarize what you said earlier, please feel free.
Well, I agree with Bill and Sam that if we do modify, and I think that modify is something I'd like to try, but it should be, strictly enforced. Fines and the inequity of the fines is important too. But to Bill's point, you've got to make sure that if you have a 2 o'clock, that it's clear by 3. Or if you until 1 o'clock, it's clear by 3 o'clock, so that if you're going to contract with Sean's or a third-party tower, that they have to have that mandate, that if we're going to give you the business, you have to guarantee that this lane of parking is going to be free by the time RAFTA is busy, whether that's 2 or 3 or whatever. But to have a modified time to serve the local businesses the traffic has to be clear when the buses are running, when the rush is on.
John?
Yeah, I've conflicted emotions about this. First of all, one of our main goals is mobility. That hangs heavy in my mind right off the bat. The other thing that I have a concern about that hasn't been addressed up here is we're talking about enforcement. And while the police department is fully staffed now, we're talking about lowering the speed limit. We've been told by the police department that's going to take extra time for them to do that. So this extra enforcement is a concern of mine. I'm not saying no to allowing some parking during the day, but I'm really conflicted about this. I should also mention that I work not far from the zone we're talking about, and this parking has affected me, and I've accepted it because we're a growing community, and mobility is, again, super important to me, and I agree with what Bill and Sam said about that.
Thanks, John.
That should be our holistic overview.
Sam, do you want to reiterate your point?
Yeah, and I just wanted to ask a question to clarify what John said, because I just want to make sure, because we're talking about the police, but the parking enforcement is done by parking ambassadors, not the police department, even though the police department can enforce parking violations.
No, they do not do this.
They
This is us.
the police do not
Unless
do
there's
park.
a safety, this is the parking department.
Okay, I just wanted to
Thanks for
make that
clearing
known.
that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm in favor of modify. I think parking should be allowed on Main Street when it's not an issue. And I mean, one of the things in my head that feels like a very simple solution is just, if there's only 9 businesses that are on Main Street, if they,
I'll get back to you on the exact number.
on the exact
I
number?
I didn't realize Diane's was a business, so
Then-
I
then-
might have missed a couple over here.
Either way, it's an amount we can,
I think there's a lot more than
Going up to 9 almost as we speak.
that. There's a lot more.
I don't necessarily want to speak for them when I say this, but I feel like they'd be on board where they want this parking there, and I think they would be pretty proactive in telling their customers, hey, you better have your car off the street by this time. Otherwise, you know, it's sort of like, if it's bad, you'd end up losing it. So I think they'd be very motivated to be like, hey, welcome, where did you park? On Main Street? Okay, we gotta make sure your car is gone by 2, otherwise we'll have issues. Yeah.
You make it sound so easy, Sam.
No, it's, you know, I just like.
It is easy.
I do just hope that, you know, we're talking about 3 to 6, and I understand the issue of not being able to move cars so easily because you need to tow them, but I know the cars that would remain in place would probably not belong to the businesses that were on Main Street, because they'd be super motivated to make sure those cars were gone by a certain amount of time, so that we weren't talking about removing parking from their businesses. So I'm very much in the camp of modify.
Thanks, Sam. Bill?
Thanks. Ian, I should have asked you this before, but, and I know you have not had much time to digest this concept, but what's your thoughts on my idea of the south side of Main parking? If you want to come up, feel free. Maybe it's easier for everyone.
Before I offered up a ton of comment, I think I would be a lot more comfortable seeing an actual like visual representation of what that would look like. You know, road space on Main Street is kind of zero-sum game, so pushing parking onto that, would you still be envisioning 2 eastbound lanes on Main Street in conjunction with that parking on the south side of Main Street?
No, the one of the 2 eastbound lanes would be used for some parking during some hours of the day,
Just
in some locations.
in some location, yeah. One of my concerns around that is the same thing we face coming out of town, where we would be pulling buses in and out of traffic lanes to access the bus stops along the south side of Main Street. So we have a bus stop at 4th Street and a bus stop at 2nd Street, as well as a bus stop at Pepke Park that would require us to merge in and out of traffic to access if that would be the case. So without, you know, seeing the exact plan and doing a study around it, which I know you weren't in support of, I would have those concerns about kind of the same issues we face on the other side.
Well, a conversation and a work session with
Yeah.
Pete is different than a study, so I'm not saying you should just take whatever they give you, but I don't want to do a long engaged study. So I guess I'm in favor of some version of modification. I would encourage you to consider this south side concept. You know, I came up with this during this meeting today, so I haven't put a ton of thought into it, to be frank. But I think it could work. Keeps the bus lane free all the time. It provides some parking to the businesses, be convenient parking. I think you could structure it 10 to 3 or something like that. You get through the morning rush. I personally have never sat in traffic backed up moving eastbound on Main Street. So I don't think that this would worsen any condition in any way. I think in addition to that, you should also create new parking options off of Main Street on the side streets. I think long-term, once some of this construction is resolved, there will be even more options on the side streets. But I sort of think of this as the best of both worlds. And then again, I think we should have a heavy hand with enforcement. I do not like rules that are not enforced. I'd rather have a lot fewer rules that are enforced than a bunch of rules that are never enforced. It breeds non-compliant behavior when you have rules that are not enforced. So if we're going to do it, let's make sure they're meaningful and important, and let's enforce them. You know, whether that's a guaranteed arrangement with a tow truck company or whether we purchase a tow truck, I think that's what it's going to take to change the behavior and get us closer to zero. So yeah, modify. And most importantly, I think this is a conversation that needs to be part of our overall traffic flow improvement studies and plans, and may require some changes then.
Bill, if I can just chime in on the south side parking. In the ski season coming, there's a lot of traffic and buses coming in from Snowmass in the evening. There's I've seen traffic backed up at the airport, so that's a factor that I've seen, that there is a lot of traffic in those bus lanes. We might wind up just having the same problem on the south side as on, and you said, to be frank, I thought you were Bill, not Frank.
It's a good one, Ward.
Pass.
That's part of why I said maybe it's 10 to 3, maybe it's 10 to 2. You know, I don't think that we can satisfy all waking hours with this. There's compromise here. I think everyone's willing to compromise here. Correct me if I'm wrong, businesses, but I think they're looking for something rather than nothing, so.
Thank you.
Can I have one clarifying? 5 modifications. You represented 2 o'clock as a good start time. Do the rest of you agree with that 2 o'clock, or do you want us to?
I think that you should maybe like work this a little bit, come back to us with, you know, that's an open-ended 1, 2, maybe you want to talk to those as what your thoughts are, but I mean, from the conversation, we know where, you know, we started this conversation, so 1 or 2 is not important right now, but we need to know a few things from you. 1 is about businesses that are actually on Main Street. 2, what are the accommodations for the side street parking? And then 3, we would want you to show us where some temporary parking on Main Street would land. And then we can figure out whether that makes sense of noon, 1, or 2 o'clock. I was saying 2 o'clock, kind of going off of what Ward was saying. If we posted it 2 o'clock, we could have it enforced by 3 o'clock.
Well, the memo said sometimes it takes 90 minutes, so maybe 1 o'clock.
Well, I understand. Exactly. So he just was saying maybe 1 o'clock, because that gives us the hour and a half for response time to get some cars towed or something. So I'm open to that. I don't want to just suggest 2 as a hard fast. I'm just saying that I agree with something, and from my experience today, 3 o'clock might be pushing it, but.
So before we make any changes, you'd like us to come back with these answers?
I think so, yeah. You know, I want to make sure that we're doing it right. You know, there's a lot of sensitivity on this issue, so I don't think we want to make sure that what we're supportive of is really being effective and efficient, and not causing more troubles.
Okay.
So we'd love to see it.
Pete, I have a question if I may. Am I correct that you removed some of the residential zone and made those short-term parking?
Yeah, and we did that for 4 locations over on 5th and 6th Street, just to see if it worked out for those groups over there. And it did. And you could do that easily for 4th, and you could start to build some of that. I think as you come closer to the core, it gets more complicated.
I think your modified plan needs to include more of that on some of those further east side streets. That'd be my request at least. And a question that we didn't talk about is, was overnight parking on Main Street allowed pre-2022 or no?
Overnight?
Overnight.
Yeah.
It was. How does that impact snow removal operations?
Snow, yeah. We'll put I think, that might be a snow zone, actually. So on Main Street, they probably had when it snows, the sign that you see in the core where if, no overnight parking if it's snowing. I think that's the similar sign that was over there previously.
So let me reframe the question, Pete. If we put back some parking on Main Street, whatever side it ends up on, what would the rules generally be?
Well, Main Street acts differently than the residents. The residents would probably still be the residential rules. And then
on Main Street specifically.
Main Street, you'd still have to have snow tows. So you'd have the snow hours where they go through there so Daniel can get in there and remove the snow. So you'd probably have 6 o'clock in the summer, and so they could park overnight in the summer. In the winter, they could park there until it snows. Essentially similar to the core would be the rules.
I feel like we might be making the rules too complicated again. I would say, this is what I would propose as the rules if you put some parking back there, is we have specific hours in which it's allowed.
Okay.
And I don't know that we're solving for that much with overnight parking on Main Street, because it's really a short-term thing, right? You gotta wake up and move the car. It's not like we're at capacity in the residential zones, even for the hotels. Maybe I'm wrong. But I would say, whatever the hour window that we end up at, maybe it's the parking's allowed from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. or whatever that window is, and otherwise it's prohibited. I think that's simpler for RAFTA. I think it's simpler for snow removal operations. I think it's simpler for the person driving to understand. So that's how I would think about structuring it personally.
And I think that we'd want to hear that back from you as well. You know, those are some alternatives that we could have. I don't know about the overnight parking and impacts, but I'm interested to hear. But like I said, I mean, I just have so many years of experience where I just never knew this to be a problem. And so, anyway, do you have any other clarifying questions for us?
No, we'll set this up. We'll get this info for you.
Yeah, I
and
appreciate it so
set this
much.
up.
Thank you to the members of the public that came out tonight. You know, this is a work session, so we don't really take a lot of public input. But we're going to adjourn here in a second. You're welcome to share your thoughts with any one of us as we're leaving.
Are we expecting this back in like information packet, work session, regular session? How are we?
I think we'll get it back in the information packet. If we need to, if we need to do direction, we'll do it at a regular meeting after we get our information packet.
We'll also, I mean, you want to get this done faster, but we'll have the study too that's coming out in the first quarter.
Thank you so much. Thanks as always to GrassRoots. That is our agenda for today. We will be back tomorrow.
Board of County Commissioner meeting and then continuance of the one here.
Hopefully you heard that.
Okay. Whatever.